Okay.
Guys, welcome to The Disruptors, the show where we talk about the future with the future-focused folks. Today, we've got somebody who's a whole lot of fun and interesting and has an awesome mustache, so we've got to give him props for that. Thanks for coming today. Ben Hammersley, right?
Thank you, yes.
Gotta give compliments where compliments are due. So I wanted to kick this off with an unconventional place because it's a podcast, and apparently you're the guy who coined the term podcast.
I am. Yeah, sadly, it's a terrible secret of mine that follows me around everywhere I go.
What is it? There's got to be a story there.
There is, and it's actually kind of it's somehow disappointing. I think in about 2004, exactly 2004, February 2004, I was one of the technology reporters for the Guardian newspaper, and at the same time, I was also writing a lot of books on coding, and I'd just written a textbook on the RSS standard, which is the underlying data standard that podcasting runs on. And there was this whole new phenomenon of people who were creating MP3 recordings and having them automatically download onto their systems because of an RSS feed. And so I wrote about this in an article in the Guardian, and it was at a time when the paper was paper-centric, in that the stories he wrote appeared in the printed page first and then were chosen for the website. And because of that, you had a very, very strong deadline, because it was when you had to physically run the presses. And I wrote this article, and about 10 minutes to go before the presses ran, I had a phone call from my editor saying, yeah, the piece is great, but we need an extra sentence because it doesn't quite fit on the page properly, and we don't have enough time to redesign the page. And so he said, can you write me another sentence? And heavily caffeinated under extreme deadlines, because you can't hold the presses back, because it costs thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars a minute for every minute you hold the presses back. I just had to come up with a sentence. And so I wrote this sort of mildly bullshit sentence, which was something like, but what do we call this new phenomenon? And then I made up some words and emailed it over to him, and it got slotted into the page, and it fitted perfectly, and everybody was happy. And then about 6 months later, I had an email from the Oxford English Dictionary saying, so you used the word podcast in this article. Where did you get that word from? And I had to confess that I sort of made it up. And they said, yeah, we think so too, because we couldn't find an earlier citation of it. And they said, well, it's going in the dictionary this year, and it's also going to be word of the year, for which I got nothing. And then a few years later, I was having a meeting at Apple in London with sort of a friend of mine who was working for iTunes at the time. And I'm sat in his office, and he was an old music industry dude, and he had all these like gold records around the wall, and a drum kit and an electric guitar and all this sort of stuff, and a fridge full of beer, and we're sat drinking beer and talking nonsense about technology or something. And there was a knock on the door, and somebody stuck their head through the door and said, are you Ben Hammersley? And I said, yes. And they said, yes, we have a message from the legal department. I said, oh yeah. I said, yes, you're not getting any money. And then closed the door and walked away. And then ever since then, it's this sort of thing that I did in like 30 seconds under the threat of a deadline has sort of followed me around. And so whenever I speak at conferences, which I do quite a lot, or speak to governments, or again, which I do quite a lot, part of the introduction that the person always makes is, and he's the man who invented the word podcast. And I'm like, this is going to follow me to the grave.
Caffeine, creativity, and a deadline. That's a lot of great things have come that way.
Well, true, but I'm not entirely sure if it's a particularly good invention to have to be your legacy. But
yeah, we'll try to give you some other things as well. So I was listening to, I found you actually, you had a talk, it's like 6 years ago, and you were debating internet censorship and if things were getting out of control 6 years ago. And that's fascinating today. Take me through that advancement, that progression, especially as someone, you're the editor-in-chief of Wired UK, you see what's happening. Where are we headed, and how have things spiraled out of control?
Well, it's a difficult question, isn't it? Because we have these sorts of balances that we have to sort of, that a society is learning to come to terms with the power of the internet. 20 or 30, 20 years ago, 25 years ago, there was this idea that simply by connecting people across the globe, you would create this digital global village with this idea that you would bring about world peace and mutual understanding and all of that sort of thing. And there's the sort of famous quote about, only connect and the devil will die, and all of all these sorts of ideas. And that was certainly one of the sets of ideas that the early protagonists of the internet and the early visionaries of the web had, was that you connect people together without censorship, without government interference, and people would gather together in a global community of peace and love and understanding. And so from that point of view, 20 years ago, censorship was a complete anathema, or at least any form of restrictions on free speech was a complete anathema to this vision of truth and happiness. But over the past 20 years, and over our experience of using the net and using the web, we've realized on many levels that that's actually nonsense. That free speech or the free sharing of ideas does require a certain degree of moderation. It does require a certain degree of rules and people to enforce those rules to enable civilized discourse and genuine sharing of ideas. And so the debate has changed over the past decade or so to start to bring into the arguments more of a support for, if not censorship, which is traditionally something that governments do, which would be, here in the US, of course, would be completely illegal because it would be unconstitutional. It would be against the First Amendment. But if not censorship, then certainly some form of rules of speech on a site-by-site or service-by-service basis, which it turns out that if you don't have them, then the quality of speech overall falls rapidly. Whereas if you do have them, and the sorts of communities online where there are strong community guidelines and strong moderation, then the quality of the discourse and the quality of the arguments gets better and better. And so we're now really learning as a community and as people, right? We're learning how these sorts of networks work. And it's not surprising in many ways that 20 years ago, or even 10 years ago, we were wrong, because we just didn't have very much experience using, very much experience as individuals. Even the most digitally advanced, even the most digitally experienced individuals still aren't that experienced. If the old Malcolm Gladwell thing, which isn't necessarily true, but if the old Malcolm Gladwell thing of it takes you 10,000 hours to be like an expert in a particular subject, if that's true, or if that's a good ballpark figure, then if you are mindfully online for an hour and a half a day, it's still going to take you 20 years to be any good at it. And so what we're seeing now in terms of as regards censorship is just people getting to that 20-year point and realizing that some of the things we assumed were right and good and idyllic are wrong, based on the behavior of other people.
How do we deal with that? So there's the whole, we should censor this, we should kick Alex Jones off Twitter, we should do these kind of things. And they seem like the right thing to do because they are in the individual circumstance, but the precedent and the power doesn't go away. Precedents don't get weaker. The position gets stronger and stronger. And the same is true with rules and whoever's in charge. What do you think?
Well, up to a degree, right? I mean, it's the old punching Nazis argument. Just because you're in favor of punching Nazis doesn't mean you're in favor of punching everybody. There is no slippery slope in punching Nazis, right? You punch a Nazi, there's not a slippery slope to punching everybody. And it's the same thing, I think, with freedom of speech. The slippery slope argument which is that exactly that once we have the infrastructure to censor people, we'll just keep censoring people until the only people are left are me and my friends. Just isn't true. It just doesn't. It's not the case. And there are, on the one hand, and also on the other hand, there are certain types of online speech which itself closes down other types of online speech. So we see, especially from the alt-right, many different debating techniques which they use very specifically to close down the possibilities of other discussions. Whether that's brigading or sea lining or any of the other sort of terms that we use to describe their rhetorical techniques, they're not acting they're not acting in good faith. And so anybody who is acting in bad faith in that respect doesn't get to play the game. And it's not a slippery slope, because it's not a matter of disagreeing with those people. It's a matter of the fact that they spoil the game. They actually ruin the discourse. Their aim isn't to win the battle of ideas by having better ideas. Their aim is to win the battle of ideas by causing the other people to give up. And that's a fundamentally different thing. If you were to argue with Alex Jones on the basis of the veracity of his ideas, he would lose immediately because he's an idiot, right? I mean, his ideas are false, completely false. They're entirely wrong. And this is not a matter of aesthetic opinion. He's just an idiot. But it's very difficult to have a good faith discussion with him about the fact that he's an idiot because of his rhetorical techniques, which involve a lot of screaming, or the online equivalent of screaming. And so because they're not playing in good faith, they don't get to play at all in a civilized system.
Well, it's the same thing with Trump, but he won that game.
Well, indeed. I mean, that's the thing. I mean, that's one of the things we're seeing with media at the moment, is that that there's always been within modern journalism, there's always been this assumption that the players of the game, whether that's the president or the prime minister or a senior politician, whoever it is, that they're not lying. Right, and so the system is set up. The system cannot deal with, and this is very much the case with Trump. The system, just journalism in general, cannot deal with the fact that literally everything he says is a lie. Right? Because they're very, very squeamish, systemically, institutionally, very, very squeamish from just saying, of the 150 definitive statements he made in the State of the Union, 130 of them are provably false. Right? It's because it's just systemically really, really difficult to say that, even though that thing is actually the case. And that's why modern journalism has a real problem, because there is also this idea of a sort of a fair play, and that everybody is coming into these arguments in good faith. And if you have a bad faith actor like the president or like the alt-right on Twitter or whatever it is, the rules of the game fall apart.
They do, and I want to get back to that. But how do we fix media then? And I think advertising is one of the driving forces behind the problem. Mm-hmm. But how can we deal with that? And can we regulate or rule-based something into that to avoid those types of inherent problems?
I don't know if you can. I mean, there are some things you can do in that you can encourage advertisers or discourage advertisers from supporting, usually unconsciously supporting those sorts of outlets. And there's an organization, for example, here in the US called Sleeping Giants that does that. That basically, if you advertise on Alex Jones, as an example, Sleeping Giants will notice and will contact you, and thousands of people will contact that advertiser saying, "Hey, do you realize where your ad spend is going?" And that usually gets that advertising pulled because somebody within that advertiser goes, "Oh, no, you're right. We don't want our brand sitting next to, we don't want our brand associated with this person or this type of speech." And so that's pulled away, and they lose their income. And so we've seen that with quite a few sort of alt-right type personalities, where they just lose their income because the infrastructure that pays for it, the advertising, the payment processors, all those sorts of people withdraw their facilities from them. And that's a good way of doing it, but that's a good way of being active. But in terms of discourse, I think what you just need is you need to have, no matter how much if you genuinely profess to have a system which values free speech, you have to not think of free speech as just not censoring or not moderating. You have to think about it as protecting the playing area, right? As protecting the free speech arena in the first instance. And so when Twitter, for example, say, well, we're in favor of the free exchange of ideas and free speech, and therefore we don't moderate, we don't proactively moderate, they're actually entirely missing the point, because they're not in favor of speech in that case, because they're not protecting a place where ideas can be freely expressed and exchanged, because you have these bad actors who step in and like break the game. Like, they have to be playing by the same rules. And so it's actually like, in a weird way, censorship is the thing that prevents censorship, right? It's like moderation is the thing that actually protects freedom of speech, because you have these bad actors.
So I think we could definitely agree. We want to try to take the bots and trolls out of the system, ideally via an automated way. Although it's harder to play defense than it is to play offense. So that in and of itself is a big problem. But then who decides what the rules are? So I've heard a lot of people advocating for the idyllic white and shining armor type dictator. Zuckerberg should take this guy off, but they should take that person off. But when one person has that power, what happens when you don't like the next guy who gets his job?
Then you don't use that system, right? I mean, it's not mandatory to use Twitter or Facebook. And at some point, they're going to have to take a stance, because otherwise you end up being like those sorts of Twitter-esque copies like Gab or all those other ones, which were like almost entirely Nazi, right? And they just become poisonous to everybody else. And as the level of as you have people in there poisoning the well, eventually the well gets so poisoned that nobody wants to drink from it. And so I think that the management or the boards of those sorts of companies which have this sort of reach do need to very rapidly come to a realization that their adherence to these sorts of theoretical arguments about slippery slopes and who's going to be the next guy to come along, and and if we're banning Nazis now, we'll be banning vegetarians next week or whatever. They actually just have to take a stance and declare what their stance is, and then we can choose. But at the moment, their stance in not taking a stance is that they are actually actively encouraging bad guys, right?
How should they choose a line?
Well, that's up to their own particular conscience and political beliefs and whatever it is, right? But they need to be open about it, and the line does have to be drawn. And at the moment, they are drawing a line.
They're just not acknowledging it.
They're just not acknowledging it. And the line that they're drawing is they're kind of into it, right? For all of their talk about free speech, if you continue to allow well-poisoning personalities on your network, if you continue to allow trolls, if you continue to allow, those sorts of systemic personal attacks and all of that sort of thing, if you continue to allow that on your network, then once you've been made aware of it more than a few times, once this discussion is in the public domain, which it is, once these things have been acknowledged as being a major issue for the 21st century civilization, which it has been, once you have all, this isn't a secret, once all this stuff is out and is being discussed in the general scheme of things, at a certain point, the rest of the users, the rest of the audience have to go, well, actually, it turns out, you're not part of the solution, so by definition, you're kind of part of the problem here. And so, maybe the Twitter board are white supremacists, right?
Do you think it'll get to the point where some state actor, I know we see it a lot in Europe now, essentially views one of these companies as a national security threat and acts to shut the company down in some way?
No, but I don't think a national security threat, but it certainly happens in Europe that they have certain rules around civil discourse. So, for example, in Germany, it's extremely illegal to be a Nazi. right? And so actually, so this is a very entertaining thing to do. If you go into Twitter and you set your location as German, right? If you set your account to be a German account rather than an American account, and you VPN to Twitter through Germany, through a German endpoint on your VPN, you won't be able to find any of these alt-right people because Twitter does filter them, right? Because legally they have to in Germany to operate in Germany. And so they have the technology, they have the systems, they have the lists of the people, they know who they all are, because in Germany they're not allowed to publish them. And so they don't. So if you want a Nazi-free social media, just pretend to be German. And nobody in Germany goes, "Oh my God, this is a threat to our freedom of speech that we can't read these alt-right dudes at all," because they know the slippery slope, right? The slippery slope isn't towards the censorship of liberals. The slippery slope is towards more Nazis. So they, I think we will see a lot more of those sorts of things, and certainly we're seeing them. The Chinese, to a certain degree, have that, but for lots of different reasons. The Russians have just said they're going to do the same thing again for different reasons, but it's entirely possible. And we already have rules of propriety. We have rules of propriety on television and the press, in terms of what you can print and what you can say before certain times of day and things like that. And so it's like we've already had that discussion. It's something that we're very used to culturally. We have ratings for movies, right? There are some movies you can't go and see in the cinema unless you're over the age of 18, right? That's not censorship. That's just moderation, common sense, right? And it's the same thing I think with social networks. And there's nothing stopping these people from starting their own blog. You know what I mean? I mean, that's the other thing. It's not as if they're providing a public service. If you're a Nazi, go and get yourself a blog. Blog away.
As long as you can
Speak
write.
as much as you like. Yeah, well, that might be an issue for them. But
so I wanna transition. I heard you talk about the dictator's dilemma, and you brought up China. You've brought up some more authoritarian regimes. Can you explain the concept?
Yeah, so the dictator's dilemma was a concept that specifically came up in the Obama era, or in the Hillary era State Department, in their foreign policy, which was this idea that as the world got more and more digital, dictators would want to, sort of authoritarian leaders of countries would want to have the best. Would want to have the internet because they would want to have all the stuff that the internet brings. Right, and even if whether that's things for their country, or even it's just down to the fact that their teenage son wanted to play World of Warcraft, right? Whatever it is, right? They want to have the modern world, and so they want to have connectivity. They want to have cell phones. They want to have 4G. They want to have, all of that sort of stuff. But, and this was the basis of that era's foreign policy from the US. The idea was that once those networks were in those countries, then they inherently weakened the authority of an authoritarian leader. In that, the theory was that once you gave everybody cell phones and connectivity, they would be able to access a lot more, many more things that were culturally and journalistically critical of their leader. They would be able to communicate with each other and organize, and so you end up with the Arab Spring was the theory. It's now, I think, seem to be a little bit more complex than that, in that really presupposed a dictator who didn't understand the internet. And so they just saw it as being a place of gadgets and cool stuff. What we now have, of course, are authoritarian leaders who, if not themselves, then certainly their people are very digitally savvy and are able to at least attempt to have the best of both worlds for them, which is to have access to the world digitally to enable online banking and all those things that we have in the modern world, but at the same time have a regime which clamps down on all the things that they would seem to be somewhat suspicious. You know, revolution and so on. And so in China is a good example of that. I think a lot of the Middle East, a lot of the Gulf states, Turkey, Russia is about to attempt it, etc., etc. And so I'm not sure now if we were to revisit the dictator's dilemma, it would actually be seen to be that much of a dilemma, because there are plenty of people who would facilitate the dictator's dream, which is they get all the good bits of the internet and they get to control their own thing as well.
And it's often been argued that a decentralized capitalist approach will outperform a centralized socialist or communist one. I've also heard it said that that's because there's not enough data and power. Do you think that's changing?
I think it's nonsense in the first instance. I think China is a really good example, right? In theory, sure. In theory, the free market works way better than a centrally planned government, and certainly the difference in economies between Western Europe and North America and Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union over the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s is a good example of that. But it's very much more complex than that, than just saying free market capitalism is better than authoritarian regimes, because you only have to look at China, which is a sort of a weird combination of the two. It's on the one hand, it's both an exceptionally free market and capitalist, but it's also very centrally planned and authoritarian. And so what we're realizing, I think, now is that you can have free market authoritarianism, right? The free market and democracy aren't necessarily interlinked in a way that we used to think was necessary. That you could have a dictator-led free market economy, and in many cases that actually works better, because you have this weird situation here in the West, which is politicians are only in power for say 4 years, or 2 years if they're Congress people, whatever it is, like a short period of time, and so the political cycle and the planning cycle is very, very short. Whereas in China, because it's an authoritarian regime, their planning cycle is 20 years long or 50 years long. And so their political decisions are much more long-term. And in terms of things like government spending and infrastructure and those sorts of plans. And so they can make very, very ambitious infrastructure plans, which just we can't do here. And so there's an interesting conversations to be had about which is more successful. And it depends on your personal values. If you personally value democracy over and above everything, then of course the authoritarian regimes are abhorrent to you. If you value economic growth, then the fastest growing economy in the world is an authoritarian dictatorship, right? China. And so
do you think this is an inflection point?
Well, it's not. I don't think it's an inflection point so much as just that a lot of our discourse in the West about this is incredibly old-fashioned and incredibly based on weird 1950s, 1960s Americana views of the world, which is capitalism good, socialism bad, and certainly in American political discourse over the past 30 years, all that was needed up until the past couple of years, all that was needed to shut down any argument or shut down any idea would be to point at it and call it socialism, right? And certainly what's happened in the past year or two, just looking at the opinion polls around specific ideas, what's happened in the past year or two is that the majority of voters in the US are no longer of the age where socialism is a keyword which triggers a mind trap which shuts down thinking. And so we now have all of these really interesting things that are coming through Congress right now with this latest group of latest group of representatives, which are being accused by the Republicans of being socialist, and that magical word isn't having its effect anymore. And so there were some really interesting surveys that came out this week, which basically showed that support for what would be traditionally called socialist policies, things like single-payer healthcare, for example, is actually very high all the way across the political spectrum, and that using the S word, it no longer works as a magic trick to close those ideas down. And so that might be an interesting inflection point, but in the US, in the rest of the West, it's never been quite like that, because the vast majority of Western democracies have always been social democratic. They've always been pretty center left compared to the US. So I don't think it's necessarily a global inflection point in terms of authoritarianism or something like that. But what we have got here is like it's almost as if the American political system has just sort of matured a little bit more and starting to catch up with the rest of the planet.
It has, and also hasn't at the same time. It's the ironic statement, right?
Yeah, I mean, but I think in many ways you can look at the current presidency and that's almost like the last dying gasp of the old-fashioned way, right? One of the reasons why those guys are really going for it so hard is because in their heart of hearts they know this is their last chance, right? And in fact, it's been said, a lot of the old Republican senators have said this, like they realize that with the demographic changes that are coming across the US, with the aging population, with the way that the voting patterns are happening, like they don't have much longer left in the sort of political cycle for any of the stuff they want to fly, because whether if it's not the next election, but certainly in say 10 years time, most of their voters will be dead. And there isn't, for example, right, we're now recording this in like the middle of February 2019. Every single person who was born in the 20th century can now vote, as of a month ago. So like all millennials can now vote. That is both an obvious thing because of the date it is, but it's also a really, really powerful thing in terms of the political swing. You have a completely different demographic of people coming through and coming into politics and being politically active, and as the baby boomer generation sort of passes on and the millennials come up and whatever we're calling the generation below that, right? Then we're going to see a completely different change in ideas, and a lot of this sort of the Trumpist stuff is really like the last dying gasp.
What happens with the US? You have an inherently two-party system. You can't really get away from that, from the winner-take-all dynamic. It's formed almost as poorly as it could be in terms of democracies, based off of the election scientists we've had on the program who've analyzed it. It's the worst one they've ever seen. But sure. What happens as we start to get these changing demographics and beliefs? Will the Republican Party fade away? Well, things can't really come to the center, because then they become the same thing, and you don't want to be the same thing, because then you've died.
Well, no, but they'll evolve. I mean, one of the like super annoying argumentative tropes that you get on Twitter all the time is highlighting the fact that it was a Republican who ended slavery. Because in terms of race relations, the Republicans and the Democrats have changed sides, as it were. So they'll just evolve. Everybody evolves. And the Republican Party of 2050 will be completely different to the one today, and the Democratic Party of 2050 will be completely different to the one today, and they'll just evolve in their own way, which is why it's always bad. It's almost like one of those sort of conversations that they have at the beginning of a football game or a basketball game or something, where they say, the 20 times these teams have met each other in the past 10 years, this is how it's been. The Rams have won this many times, and and of course those are completely meaningless stats, right? Because it's not the same people. The team isn't the same. The name is the same, but the logos aren't fighting each other. It's the people and the ideas that they have and the way that they play the game, as it were. And so it doesn't really the name and the logo and the people will change. The name and the logo will stay the same, but the people and the ideas will change, and they'll change over time.
So we just have to hope.
The Republican Party of today is completely different to the Republican Party of Reagan, for example. Yeah. They believe they're the heirs of Reagan, but if you compare the policies, they're completely different.
Yeah, it's interesting how we change the past. We'll have to make sure we don't invent too much life extension technology too quickly, or we may save too many politicians. And that would be a terrible tragedy for all of us. Innovation happens.
This is an interesting question, actually, that I think might be something to. I mean, your point is actually quite a good one in terms of term limits, where you have certain people, and this is the same in every country, I think, but you have certain people who remain in power because they have a very strong power base and a very strong team in their constituency, their state, or whatever it is, but they're blatantly not mentally all there, right? Because they're old and they're just not. They just shouldn't be in power because they're just not 100%. And that's going to be a real issue as lifespans get longer and people's ability to at least appear as if they're fit and healthy gets longer. That you end up with representative politicians who are maybe physically strong, and politically strong in terms of their infrastructure, but cognitively losing it somewhat.
Might be there. So what's a day in the life of sorry, that was a low blow. Sorry, Trump. If you want to come on, I'm happy to talk. I'll put on a toupee as well. What's a day in the life of a Wired editor-in-chief like?
Well, I'm not editor-in-chief, I'm editor-at-large. But
editor-at-large. What is the difference as well?
Well, editor-in-chief gets paid a lot more money. Editor-in-chief is in charge of the magazine, and an editor-at-large is somebody who is not allowed in the office anymore for being too distracting. My job is to, I work mostly professionally as a futurist. And that's what I write about for Wired and other magazines and newspapers and so on. But professionally as a futurist, my job is to help companies and individuals think about the implications of new technologies and how their business models will change, and how society will and the culture will change around those business models, and come up with scenarios that will reflect the world in which they will be operating in 3 to 5 years' time, in order to give them ideas about how they need to prepare for that. And that prepare in terms of products, but also prepare in terms of the way that they work, or who they recruit, or the sort of policies that they should be having, or the way that they should be thinking, and things like that. So my job is really to sort of point at stuff and go, have you thought about that? With a sort of future-facing bent, and that's to large corporations and governments around the world.
What are those 3 things? If we wanted to pack a $20,000 consulting session into here, what would those 3 to 5 things that you're most focused on and think that people are either overlooking or just not taking enough account of?
I think right now, the things I'm talking about are mostly, well, everybody is very, very excited or interested in machine learning and artificial intelligence. And I think in many ways, the reaction to that is more powerful than the thing itself. That's an interesting conversation to be having. I think the advances in science and the practice of personal performance, and all of the things we know about all of the things that need to go into somebody's life to have them be cognitively and physically suitable for the world in a few years' time, and that leads on to that's part of a wider piece, which is how do companies actually physically enact the act of innovation? How do you actually be innovative as an organization in the context of the world of, say, 2022 or 2023? So people are really interested about, so in general, to sort of make that even more wide, people are always interested in buzzword technologies, and they were always asking like those buzzword technologies to be explained and to be ranked in sort of how much we care about this. And then, but more to the point, they're interested in what does it mean for me as an individual, or for us as an organization, as an organization looking for individuals. And then it's all about how do we as an organization undergo the practice of transformation so that this stuff doesn't blindside us like the internet blindsided so many organizations 10 years ago or 20 years ago.
And Netflix has done a great job of this. They've managed two transitions wonderfully, killing Blockbuster and killing a lot of other businesses. What was it like working for Netflix? So the cyber crimes, tell me about it.
Oh, well, that was just making a TV series for them. I think that's a good example of a couple of things. One is just a sort of a cultural shift, which is that we have to part of planning for the future or thinking about the future is that you have to be very, very clear about the present. It's actually probably the 99% of the job about thinking about the future is actually being very clear-eyed about what it is about today. And so making this series on cybercrimes was very much about that, was actually trying to get people to understand what the world is like today. Most people don't live in the present day. This is actually this is a trope with most organizations, that I'm invited into many corporations to talk to them about the future, and actually my job is to talk to them about the present. Very, very few companies actually live in 2019. It's actually shocking. So there's partly that, but also it was I think the wider thing with Netflix was that that we forget their global reach, and we forget their global stance on the world, because of the fact that your version of that, because your Netflix experience is so tailored to you, especially once you've been using it for more than a few months or whatever it is, and it gets to know your tastes and so on. When you log into Netflix, and you see what it's offering you, it gives you things that it's very difficult. It's very unusual to be totally surprised by the stuff that appears in the first few pages of your Netflix queue, because it's tailored to you. But actually, if you go down and you look deep into their catalog, you find that they are actually an insanely international organization. They have huge amounts of international productions and huge amounts of stuff in other languages and things like that. And so when my series was on there, the thing that really sort of struck me was the amount of people that I had around the world who'd I would be on the street in like Buenos Aires or somewhere like that, and people were like, "Oh, I saw you on TV yesterday." And that, I think, is something that, again, that we forget about Netflix, because we always see companies like that through our own experience and through our own viewpoint, which is always, in both our cases, is like dudes in North America, whereas actually they have an awful lot of really cool stuff for teenage girls in Japan or whatever, right? And so it was for me, it was seeing their reach and also seeing the effect of their very, very, very purposeful present dayism. Never mind futurism, right? They're very, very purposeful present dayism that they have, which is something that most media companies don't have. Most companies, as I say, most companies are inherently nostalgic.
Especially the media ones.
Especially the media ones, yeah.
Yeah, we've gotten by a lot of the better days. Do you think we'll see a revolution in media coming, where things start to pick back up and change drastically? Or are we in for more of the same?
Well, I think we're in the middle of it. We're in the middle of a huge revolution in media. It's just that I think the thing about many of the issues, this is part of the problem of helping people. I'm in the middle of writing a book chapter on this very specific issue, which is that genuine and true, like, life-changing innovation rapidly becomes incredibly banal, because if it's totally life-changing, it changes your life, and then your life is that thing, and then after very, very rapidly, you don't remember that that's innovative, right? And so and you forget the way you used to do something even 5 or 10 years ago, which in the grand scheme of things is a very short period. And so things like media, the sort of $10 a month subscription services like Netflix and Hulu and things like that are actually relatively very new. Podcasts, in terms of a professionalized, dominant media form, is extremely new. Getting your news from the web is still culturally incredibly new. All of those things, and so we are in the middle of a media revolution. It's just that the media changes relatively slowly, and B, we don't necessarily recognize the fundamental shift in the media industry because it's happened, it's just part of our lives. And so we forget, for example, 25 years ago, local newspapers, certainly in the UK where I grew up, but also here in the US, 25 years ago, local newspapers contain your entire life. It would have the announcement of your birth. It would have the announcement of your marriage. It would be where you found your first job. It would be where you found your first apartment. It was where you booked your holiday from. It's where you found out what was on TV that night. It's where you read about the local sports team. It's where you found out what was happening in the local cinema. It was the local newspaper was the core of everything. It's where you bought your first car. It's where all these things. And it's only 20, and now all of that is dead, right? Exactly, and that happened 20 years ago. And in the grand scheme, for many people listening to this, 20 years ago is it's more than a lifetime ago, and you don't remember any of that sort of stuff. But in terms of the media industry, that's hardly any time at all. And a good deal of the stuff, if you walk around the media industry, a good deal of the weird stuff is actually just the skeleton remains of the old way of doing stuff. And a lot of the so-called crises of the media industry are actually just people being very nostalgic about the old ways, or the old, how do we get back to it being like that again? We'll never get back to it being like that again, because it was 20 years ago. And that's where you end up with these really weird conversations where somebody like BuzzFeed wins major awards, because in the eyes of an old-fashioned journalist, who started off in newspapers like myself, BuzzFeed are the people who do those things about how you find out which Buffy character you are, right?
Or the best top 10 list.
Exactly, but actually, of course, BuzzFeed has, as well as obviously I'm Spike, BuzzFeed has some really, really, really good investigative journalism, and the stories that they break are really great. Right, they're the real deal as far as journalism is concerned. And so, but depending on your viewpoint, that's either utterly uncontroversial and kind of boring, to say so, or it's completely bizarre, or it's the natural scheme of things, or it's this bizarre change of the culture and the industry. So we're in the middle of that revolution. It's just that for many of us, we don't notice. We don't know because it's a slow motion revolution.
You don't notice your hair growing. So
exactly.
You have a very interesting background, not just at work, but also personally. What's up with the adventure sports? A pilot, a rescue diver? What do you do for fun, and where does this energy come from?
Caffeine, caffeine, sugar.
How'd you get into rescue diving?
Well, it seemed to be a good thing at the time. I like to do stuff that requires really, really, really deep focus. And I only realized this actually retrospectively for many of these things, but both that and say being a pilot are not things that you can do and check your email at the same time. So they require require a combination of intellectual and physical and psychomotor and focus and all these different skills all coming together. in one sort of flow state. And so it's really just been always chasing those sorts of activities, which are really just full on and require complete focus and concentration. And the same thing, journalistically, I was a war correspondent for quite a while, and you can't be in Afghanistan in the back of a gunship flying through the mountains at 60 feet off the ground or something and be like, wondering what's happening on Twitter. Or at least it discourages you from that. And so I find myself very much looking for those sorts of all-encompassing challenges in order to sort of create that sort of level of concentration and focus, which I find to be very relaxing.
It feels like that's something a lot of people are missing.
Yeah, maybe. Or maybe they're really lucky and they find that in, making their breakfast in the morning or something like that. In many ways, I think it might actually just be a lacking of a brain chemical that I need to have, those sorts of peak experiences in order to be normal. It would be really nice to get the same sort of experience from just emptying my inbox or completing it, hitting a deadline, writing deadline, than I do from landing a plane in a crosswind or something like that.
But then you'd be boring. Do you meditate?
Well, quite. But I don't know. I mean, that's. Sometimes I do think about. Sometimes, not very often, and it passes very quickly. But sometimes I can be walking through an office building or something like that, or at a client's headquarters, and be like walking through the cubicle farm and just think, you know what, life would be really, really easy if I could actually deal with that.
Oh, you'd
if
hate
I
it.
could yeah, no, I would totally hate it, absolutely, 100%. But I sometimes wish that I wouldn't. You know what I mean? But that's a pointless thing to think about.
The genie's out of the bag. What is the one technology or trend you're most worried about?
In terms from a
anything.
Point of view? Interesting question. I'm not worried about AI in any way. Which is the one that everybody seems to be worried about. I'm not worried about that in any way. I'm worried in many ways about blockchain. And I'm worried about it in that it's bullshit. And I see so much cognitive effort and energy and skill and people and money going into something which is almost 100% nonsense. And specifically cryptocurrencies. I mean, the blockchain, like, there are some really interesting uses of the blockchain, full stop, but cryptocurrencies are just nonsense for lots of different reasons. And it's, it's that old thing. I've seen the greatest minds of my generation wasted on blockchain. That's a thing. I think.
If you really want to complain, then we would say photo sharing apps, though. Come on.
Well, bring back old school Flickr. I mean, seriously. Back in the day, that used to be really good.
Oh, it's still there. You get unlimited photo storage. If you're not using it, anybody, you get, I think, a terabyte of photo storage, and it's not owned. It's not owned by Google, Facebook, or Amazon at this point.
It's owned by Yahoo, though, isn't it?
Yeah, but Yahoo's dead and has no talent at this point, so it's okay.
That's very true. I mean, I wouldn't be putting any of my stuff on a Yahoo server, because at some point that Yahoo server is just going to fall over.
Fair point.
They'll forget where it is or something, or they'll have laid off the engineer and they'll have left it on for a bit, or whatever. Yeah, I mean, yeah, we do need another photo sharing site, obviously. But I think it's, in terms of economic impact, the thing that really worries me at the moment is the imminent collapse in digital advertising. I think we are very soon going to come to a very interesting reckoning around the fact that most digital advertising is based on fraud and is subprime to the extreme. and there's going to be a correction in that, because obviously digital advertising is a thing. It does work, and targeted advertising does work. It does drive people to buy stuff, and there's definitely value in that. So it's not as if digital advertising in general is worthless, but a huge proportion, and I think a much bigger proportion than we currently accept. I think a huge proportion of the digital advertising marketplace is fraudulent, is extraordinarily fraudulent. And so an awful lot of people's companies' valuations and an awful lot of business models are based on a playing field which itself is based on huge amounts of fraud. And all it needs is like one bit of the fraud to be pointed out for the whole thing to collapse.
Why do you think it's fraud? I know some of it is, but not. Why do you think a large percentage?
Because it's a really easy way of making a lot of money. You know, I know, like my neighbor, for example, is the sysadmin for a site which carries advertising, and they realized a few years ago that they could buy views, and they realized that the value, the cost to buy page views from, you know, bot farms or people in the third world or whatever would vary, and the value of click-throughs that they would get from the ads that they carried would vary. And so he wrote some software which just arbitraged that, and whenever the cost of buying a click was lower than the cost of the revenue you would get from getting the click, then it just triggers buying clicks, right? And a good proportion of that company's business is based on that arbitrage, right? No value is being created there, right? That's not feeding commerce in any way, right? That's not doing what advertising should do. And I think the same thing for an awful lot of YouTube stuff and an awful lot of, you know, Twitter stuff and things like that. And so many decisions are being made on these metrics which just aren't real. You know, I have, whatever it is, nearly 19,000 followers on Twitter. And so many people ask me, like, you know, how many followers do you have on Twitter? And then it's used as a value. It's used as a measurement of value in the some circles that I, you know, that I work in, or certain business, you know, propositions that I make. They go, oh, 19,000. But actually, genuinely, how many of those people are really alive?
How many aren't Putin?
Yeah, exactly. How many of them are bots? How many of them are people who had an account once 10 years ago and followed me and then never looked at the internet again, et cetera, et cetera? How much actual interaction is there? Very little. And the same thing for like YouTube page, you know, YouTube views. I have a 4-year-old, and if you look at a lot of the children's stuff on YouTube, and especially the super creepy, weird stuff, the stuff that James Bridle has written about in terms of like weird, almost bot created videos and stuff. You have all these weird Russian videos that have 50 million views, and there's no way on God's earth that 50 million kids watch that once, or 25 million watched it twice. Or, you know, those numbers are absolutely wrong, and there's hundreds of thousands of those videos. There's obviously something weird happening, and yet people are making massive decisions, both investment decisions and cultural decisions, based on these numbers, which are just not reflective of reality. And I think once these sorts of things start to be pointed out, then once it's pointed out that the basis of many decisions has been made on these inflated figures, whether it's buying followers, whether it's buying page views, whether it's buying video views, whether it's buying placement on the iTunes podcast charts, whatever it is, all of those things you can easily do. Once it's pointed out how fraudulent that is, a lot of this stuff falls apart. In fact, the only thing in many ways that keeps that from happening is how systemic it is. It's the too big to fail of the 20, you know, of this decade, right? That you know, just the whole influencer economy is not only based on nothing, but it's based on nothing piled on top of nothing, and that's
with a little bit of makeup on top.
Exactly, and last time we had that sort of subprime based systemic failure of numbers, it brought down the global economy. And I'm not saying it's the same as the 2008 financial crisis, but
yeah, this is the selfie crisis,
right? But Facebook's valuation, which is huge, right, is based entirely on the value that the market expresses and it has in its advertising. And if it turns out the vast majority of Facebook advertising isn't seen by humans because it's a fraudulent marketplace, then Facebook isn't worth as much as Facebook thinks it is, which brings down an awful lot of people's.
I mean, even 20% you'd have a fire sale.
You'd have a real problem, yeah, and that would have enormous knock-on effects. If you woke up tomorrow morning and found that Facebook had dropped 20%, and all of the sort of audience-based, advertising-based digital platforms had all lost 20% of their stock price overnight, that would be a big deal. And so that's actually the technology that really worries me the most, because it's a lie.
Maybe though. So let's play devil's advocate. What
Sure.
if we found that out and cost per clicks dropped 30, 40%? Would startups and companies just buy more ads and increase their ROI? Google and Facebook get screwed, but ultimately make the same amount of money. And then everyone but the affiliate marketers win. Is that a plausible scenario?
Maybe, but I think at the same time you would have a cultural shift, and the cultural shift would be towards commercial success through quality rather than commercial success through branding or hype, or branding through genuine quality rather than branding through hype. I mean, this was the idea that's been around for a very long time, actually, in the digital era, which is that it's very, very difficult. It's increasingly difficult online to make something that's rubbish, because there's so much reviewing possible. I mean, this is a massive social change that we forget as a social change. 25 years ago, it was really, really difficult to review something. It's really difficult to find a review of something, right? If you wanted to be a restaurant critic, for example, you would have to be a journalist for 20 or 30 years and eventually make your way to being a hallowed position in a newspaper, where you were then lucky enough to be made the restaurant reviewer because the previous one had died. Because it's the job that everybody wants, right? And then you become the restaurant reviewer, and you're the one restaurant reviewer in your town because your town has this one local paper, and you review one restaurant a week. And that's it. And that's like restaurant reviews. Whereas now, 25 years later, basically nothing you can do on this planet that hasn't got a specialist review site somewhere, right? There's nothing you can buy where you can't look up 1,000 reviews of that thing. There's no restaurant, there's no anything that isn't massively well reviewed everywhere. And that's from a human society point of view, that's completely new, and we totally forget this is the case, right? And so the idea was that when all of that sort of reviewing happened, the effect would be that you could no longer make terrible products, because you could no longer have your product have the branding of your product do the work for it. You can no longer bullshit about it, because you only have to sell a couple of them, and those two will be reviewed instantly by those customers, who will instantly say, yeah, the box looks really nice, and they make lots of promises, but it doesn't actually work, and then you go out of business. And so the idea will be that this would drive quality. And I think maybe we'll start to see a lot more of that sort of thing, or a lot more of emphasis on that sort of thing, that you become successful not by buying social media influence, but by making the very best thing and having genuine reviews say that this is the very best thing. So I think it's more going to be an issue of like trying to get onto Wirecutter because you make the very best whatever it is you make, rather than trying to be the number one thing because you've spent a lot of money on Twitter followers and influencers and Instagram bots.
And to play devil's advocate, coming from the Amazon side, you can also just buy the reviews. So that's the flip side of the coin. Right.
And so that of course is that of course speaks to the naivety of those of us who are making these sorts of points.
Something like 90% of the ad clicks on Facebook are older folks, because everyone else knows not to click a freaking ad.
Right, and that's actually ties in with a very interesting thing that came out a few weeks ago from Pew. We were talking about misinformation and who is it who spreads the most information on social networks, and it's absolutely 100% positively correlated with age. So, the most fake news is, fake news and misinformation and stuff like that is spread mostly by the elderly online. So when you hear people complaining about young people in their social media, ruining political discourse, it's not the case. It's the other way around.
It's because they're gullible and used to trusting. They haven't gotten that crash
Right,
course.
and it's or they're just really into the forwarded emails from your racist uncle, right? It's the same. It's a similar sort of deal. Just made much easier because of Facebook.
Yes, it is. Now we can tag everyone. This has been a fun one. We're ending on a negative note, so let's throw something positive in here to make it fun. Ben, right. What is one thing you would want to leave people with? A quote, a call to action, something exciting, something to do. What would it be and why?
Inspirational and happy, right?
Just not downright dreary and go kill myself sad.
Not upset. Yeah. God. If I think about going and get myself an extra couple of coffees. I think that one of the things we've spoken about a few times has been that a lot of this change is we don't remember, we don't think about how much change has happened because we don't remember where we started. And so a lot of the major changes that we have online are banal because they just sit in the background and we don't think of them as being new. And I think one of the things that really people don't recognize as being incredibly new and incredibly important is the fact that we now all have access online to the very best practitioners in the world of whatever it is you're into or want to be into. And this actually was a life-changing realization for me, which was a few years ago. There's a TEDx talk. It's on the TED site. There's a TEDx talk with this guy, and he does like a 4-minute TED talk about how to dry your hands in a public bathroom. It's the most like efficient and effective and least wasteful way of drying your hands in a public bathroom, right? Just go onto the TED.com and look up the video. It's like 4 minutes, and it will change your life, right? Because it turns out you've been doing it wrong. And there's another video that it always recommends, which is how to tie your shoes. Turns out the vast majority of people on the planet tie their shoes wrongly, right? And you watch these videos and you realize, holy shit, literally everything I do in my life, chances are I learned it from somebody who didn't really know how to do it themselves. Because they learned it from somebody, they learned it from their local, they learned it from their parents or their local teacher or something like that. And now we have access to all of these experts who are the very best in the world. And so literally everything in your life, you can go like, how do I brush my teeth properly? Right? How do I make a cup of tea in the best possible way of making a cup of tea? How do I, whatever the task is, right? How do I take care of my bike, which sat behind me, whatever it is. And you can go online and you can find the world's greatest person who knows about that thing. And they'll undoubtedly have made a video or written a blog post or something about that thing. And you can learn the world's best technique in that thing. And it's true for practically everything. And so we have this really strange situation now that we've kind of not realized this, that you could, even on 5 minutes a day, totally transform your life simply by just by noticing a thing that you do every day and going, I wonder if I'm doing that wrong. And you probably are. And there's probably a video online that will show you how to do it right. And then you learn that thing and it will transform your life. And if you do that 20 times, it will radically change everything in your life, because you will be drying your hands better and you'll be tying your shoes properly and you'll be making coffee in the correct way and you'll be whatever it is. And so I think for all of the censorship and bullshit around blockchain and all that sort of stuff, we tend to forget that the internet brings us these enormous blessings and this enormous ability to be really, really good at stuff. And if you really want to feel jolly and like hopeful about the future, just remember the fact that there's a video on TED that in 4 minutes will completely transform your life about how you dry your hands in the public bathroom, and you'll watch that, and then 2 or 3 times a day from then on, you will unveil your secret superpower to yourself, and you will think, actually, yeah, there's hope yet.
The most mundane things can be transformational. It's like modern day Zen Buddhism. You just do it just right and perfectly, and it changes
Well,
your life.
yes, exactly that. Exactly that.
Ben, this has been a fun one. Where's the best place for people to find you and learn more?
I'm on Twitter at Ben Hammersley is probably the best place. My tweets sort of auto delete after about 72 hours. So if you don't find anything entertaining, come back in a few days.
Whatever you do, bring your 5 Russian troll friends so that we can build up those. We can build
That's
up
right.
the follower accounts, right? People are looking.
I need to get above 20,000. Apparently, I get like invited to the Kardashians if that happens.
Oh yeah, if anyone wants to buy some for him, then you've got the address. Thanks for coming today, Ben. This has been a fun one.
Thank you very much.
Cheers, guys.
Cheers.